Tell us a little bit about why it was written and what you did to get this great story.
Yeah, well, I think two things. First of all, there were all these bestsellers, the Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins books, which, of course, I liked so much. But they were ultimately polemical works, sort of saying, we ought to move beyond religion, or we ought to get away with religion. The world would be better if people weren't so religious. And, being a sociologist, I thought, well, that may all be good and fine, but why not just look at places on the earth that actually aren't that religious and see what they're like? And, so I sort of felt that needed to be put on the table, that it's not enough just to sort of rhetorically and polemically critique religion, but to say, well, wait a minute, we can just look at our own world and look at pockets of humanity that are quite secular and see how they're faring.
Because all these televangelists like Pat Robertson and Falwell are saying, a country without God is chaotic and meaningless and unhappy and all those things.
Exactly. The Ann Coulters, the Pat Robertsons, the Rush Limbaughs, the Bill O'Reillys. I mean, this is a constant trope, and it's one of the oldest tropes in history. And as long as there's been priests, rabbis, and imams, they've been saying the same thing. We must have God at the center of our society, else it will descend into chaos, madness, crime, and debauchery and immorality, which is just simply not true.
So what did you find out?
So what I found was when I was looking at rates and patterns of belief and non-belief, the Scandinavian nations were at the top of the list in terms of being rather irreligious. Of course, there's cultural Christianity in these countries, but when it comes to actual belief and worship of God and significance of God in people's lives, it's very, very minimal there. Perhaps Denmark and Sweden are among the least religious countries in the world, or perhaps the history of the world. And then what we also find is simultaneously, these are perhaps the best countries, at least, I know that's a value judgment, but at least by standard sociological measures, they are incredibly moral and humane societies. They have the lowest rates of violent crime in the world. They have, the best elder care, the best child care. They're incredibly wealthy countries, and yet that wealth is shared to a degree unparalleled in the world.
And crime.
Crime is low. Education is strong. Hospitals do well. Pregnant mothers are taken care of. Every indicator from literacy rates to crime rates to employment rates. Whatever you want to look at, they do incredibly well, often at the top. So I thought this needs to be known. Americans need to understand that one can have a humane, prosperous, moral society without much God. And that's basically the heart of my book.
But aren't the people there sad and empty and meaningless without God?
There's a common stereotype about Scandinavians that they're dour and depressed and suicidal, and so that needs to be dispelled right off the top. They don't lead the world in suicides. In fact, Denmark and Sweden don't even make the top 20. And in terms of depression, it's interesting. The people that study this, social psychologists, actually rank nations on how content the people are, how happy the people are, and guess what? Denmark ranks in number one as sort of the most happy nation on earth, at least how does one measure these things? And I actually spent a long time interviewing Scandinavians about this exact question. How do they find meaning if there's no God and there's no afterlife? What gives their life meaning? And what I found was Scandinavians, like most secular people, have incredibly rich and meaningful lives. They find meaning in their work, their families, various causes they're involved in, traditions, the joy of nature, the joy of love, doing good. And so actually a lot of them thought it was odd that I would ask that question, what is the meaning of life? And many of them said, well, meaning of life is what you make of it. And I even had some people say, if there was a God controlling everything and this was just a prelude to heaven or hell, that would make this life seem meaningless, and not the other way around. So they're actually not a very sad and depressed lot, but they're a content people. They may not be as gregarious, let's say, as your average American or Italian, but nonetheless, the notion that without much God a society would collapse is simply untrue.
Now, in the cover of your book, there's such a nice summary where it says that you counter the claims of outspoken conservative American Christians who argue that a society without God would be hell on earth. It is crucial, you believe, for Americans to know that society without God is not only possible, but it can be moral, successful, and downright pleasant.
Indeed.
And didn't you call, what was it Aarhus? How do you say that city?
Yeah, Aarhus.
Didn't you say that it might be the closest thing to a secular heaven on earth? Or something like that?
That's how I saw it. I mean, of course these aren't completely secular societies. One must acknowledge that you hear the church bells on Sunday morning. Of course, no one goes to church. They have the lowest rates of church attendance in the world. But, despite the fact that there are, vestiges of religion here and there, generally, I would say if for a secular person, Copenhagen, Aarhus, or Stockholm, these are kind of secular paradises. I mean, they're well-functioning cities. Everything, they're very rational cultures. The buses work. They're clean. It's very safe. Children wander freely home from school, downtown. There's a sense that life is, modern life can run smoothly. When people lose their jobs, they aren't destitute. They have good health coverage no matter what. They can get training in new jobs. I mean, I went to mental health facilities. I interviewed hospice nurses, doctors, politicians, lawyers, police officers, and I just found that one could I stood in awe often, thinking, look what humans can do if they put their mind to it. And keep in mind, Scandinavia was among the poorest regions of the world 150, 200 years ago. These were cold, desolate places. Most people left. And yet in about 100 years, through sort of rational coming together, these people were able to create extremely prosperous, well-functioning, extremely safe, humane societies. So yes, whether I was drinking beer at a cafe or catching the bus for an interview or working up at the university or just taking my kids to the beach, I often felt like I was living in a bit of a secular paradise.
Some people in our country would say that you can get that effect if you have a really strong police force. What did you see there?
Yes, I saw almost no police. In fact, that was one of the first things I observed. I wasn't looking to study criminal justice. I wasn't going to Scandinavia to investigate these issues. But suddenly, it's sort of like sometimes you only notice the humming of the refrigerator when it shuts off. I suddenly noticed there were no police anywhere. This is a major metropolitan city, 250,000 people. We arrived in summer with my children and my wife, and we were going all over, and we never saw any police. In fact, just to make sure I wasn't sort of fooling myself, I kept a journal, and I got through 31 days without seeing any police presence. That means a police car, a foot patrolman, anything. For 31 days, no cops. And I inquired about this extensively. And in Denmark, you have very little police compared to what we have in the United States. You have the softest penalties in the world for violent crimes. You have the most humane prisons that focus on rehabilitation. And yet despite all this, despite a low police presence, fairly gentle punishments, no death penalty, yet despite all of this, Danes and Swedes have the lowest violent crime and murder rates in the world, and they're not running around killing each other, and they're not. So it's a lot of myth busting.